Barbara Wright vanished from a locked hospital floor with no way out except through security checkpoints. The cameras saw her enter but never leave. When they found her scrubs in the laundry room, still containing traces of blood that wasn't from any patient, the small Utah mountain town of Cedar Ridge would never be the same again. It was March 23, 1996, and the night air carried the last bite of winter through the valleys surrounding Cedar Ridge Community Hospital. Barbara Wright pulled her navy blue cardigan tighter as she walked across the poorly lit parking lot, her white nursing shoes silent against the wet asphalt. At 43, Barbara had the kind of face that patients trusted immediately. Warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that had comforted thousands during their darkest hours. Cedar Ridge Community Hospital wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest three-story brick building that served the mountain communities scattered throughout this remote corner of Utah. Most of the 15,000 residents knew each other by name, and Barbara Wright was as much a fixture in their lives as the old Methodist church on Main Street or the weathered bronze statue of Brigham Young in the town square. Barbara had worked the night shift for 15 years, ever since her divorce left her needing the differential pay to support her teenage daughter Sarah. She preferred the quiet hours between midnight and 7 a.m., when the hospital settled into its peaceful rhythm and she could focus on the patients who needed her most. The terminally ill, the post-surgical cases, the elderly residents of the long-term care wing who often confused night with day. That Saturday night started like any other. Barbara clocked in at 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes earlier than usual, because she'd stopped to help Mrs. Peterson find her reading glasses in the employee break room. She picked up her assignment sheet from charge nurse Linda Morrison, a woman 10 years her junior who still called her Miss Barbara out of respect. "Light night tonight," Linda said, not looking up from the medication cart she was restocking. "We've got Mr. Henley in 301 post-op from his gallbladder surgery, Mrs. Chen in 308 with pneumonia, and that new admission in 314. Elderly gentleman came in this afternoon with chest pains. Dr. Martinez wants vitals every 2 hours." Barbara nodded, scanning the patient list. Room 314 was at the far end of the third floor, in what the staff called the quiet wing, because it housed patients who needed minimal intervention during the night hours. The wing had its own security camera at the entrance, installed just 6 months earlier after the hospital board decided they needed better monitoring of who accessed the medication storage areas. "What's his name?" Barbara asked, referring to the patient in 314 inches. "Edgar Thorne, 81 years old, no family listed. Pretty confused when he came in. Kept asking about someone named Martha, but there's no Martha in his emergency contacts." Linda paused, finally looking up. "You know how it is with the older ones sometimes." The heart episode probably scared him. Barbara understood. In 15 years of night nursing, she'd learned that fear and confusion often went hand in hand, especially for elderly patients thrust into the sterile, unfamiliar environment of a hospital. Building trust was half the job, and Barbara had a gift for it. But something felt different about tonight. As Barbara walked toward the quiet wing, she noticed the temperature seemed to drop with each step. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows along the corridor walls. She'd worked in this hospital long enough to know its quirks. The way the heating system groaned on cold nights, how certain light fixtures needed replacement, the spots where the linoleum had worn thin from decades of foot traffic. This felt different, wrong. The hospital had been built in 1962, replacing the original Cedar Ridge Medical Clinic that had served the community since the 1930s. Barbara had heard stories from the older nurses about strange occurrences in the building. Voices in empty rooms, equipment that moved on its own, patients who claimed to see people who weren't there. She'd always attributed these tales to the stress of working night shifts and the natural tendency for medical professionals to develop superstitions about places where so many people had died. But tonight, walking through the dimly lit corridors toward room 314, Barbara felt something she had never experienced in 15 years of nursing. A presence. Something watching her from the shadows between the flickering lights, following her progress with patient, ancient eyes. She made her first rounds at midnight, moving quietly through the dimly lit corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who could navigate the building blindfolded. Mr. Henley was sleeping peacefully, his post-surgical pain managed by the morphine drip. Mrs. Chen woke briefly when Barbara checked her oxygen levels, offering a weak smile and a whispered, "Thank you, dear," before drifting back to sleep. Room 314 was different. Edgar Thorne was awake, sitting upright in bed with his thin hands gripping the rails. His silver hair was disheveled, and his pale blue eyes darted around the room as if tracking something only he could see. When Barbara entered, those eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," she said gently, approaching the bed with her hands visible, the way she'd learned to do with agitated patients. "I'm Barbara, your night nurse. How are you feeling?" "She's coming," Edgar whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system. "She's coming for me, just like she said she would." Barbara checked his chart. No mention of dementia or psychiatric history, though hospital records from 1996 were far less comprehensive than they would become in later years. His admission notes indicated he'd been brought in by ambulance after experiencing chest pains at his home on Maple Street, a modest two-story house where he'd lived alone since his wife's death in 1987. "Who's coming, Mr. Thorne? Is there someone you'd like us to call?" "Martha." His grip on the bed rails tightened until his knuckles went white. "She said she'd find me. Said she'd make me pay." Barbara made a note to discuss Edgar's mental state with Dr. Martinez in the morning, but for now she focused on his immediate needs. His vitals were stable, though his blood pressure was slightly elevated, likely from anxiety. She checked his IV line, adjusted his pillows, and spoke to him in the soothing tone that had calmed countless patients over the years. "You're safe here, Mr. Thorne. This is a hospital and we're taking good care of you. Try to get some rest." But Edgar's eyes never left her face. "You don't understand," he said. She's not like other people. Not anymore." A chill ran down Barbara's spine, though she couldn't say why. She'd heard similar words from confused patients before, but something in Edgar's voice, in the way his eyes darted to the window as if expecting someone to appear there, felt different, more urgent, more real. As Barbara finished Edgar's assessment, she became aware of other strange occurrences throughout the wing. The temperature continued to drop, despite the heating system running normally. The security camera at the wing's entrance had begun to flicker, its red recording light blinking erratically. Most unsettling of all, she heard what sounded like footsteps in the corridor behind her, but when she turned to look, the hallway was empty. The footsteps had a distinctive rhythm, the soft shuffle of someone wearing nursing shoes, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone making rounds. Barbara had heard similar sounds countless times during her career, but these footsteps seemed to echo from a different era, as if someone from the hospital's past was still making their appointed rounds. Barbara finished her assessment and left the room, but Edgar's words followed her down the hallway. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more than usual as she completed the rest of her rounds, and when she passed the security camera at the entrance to the quiet wing, she felt oddly grateful for its presence, even as it continued to malfunction. At 1:15 a.m., Barbara returned to the nurse's station to document her findings and prepare medications for her 2 a.m. rounds. The quiet wing felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. The fluorescent lights continued to flicker, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made the shadows seem to move and dance along the walls. As she worked at her computer, updating patient charts and medication schedules, Barbara became aware of a sound coming from the direction of room 314. It was faint at first, like wind through the building's aging ventilation system, but as she listened more carefully, she realized it wasn't mechanical. It was human, a voice calling from somewhere deeper in the quiet wing. "Edgar," the voice called, barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise. "Edgar, I've been waiting." Barbara looked around the nurse's station, but she was alone. Linda Morrison was on the other side of the hospital, attending to patients in the main wing. There were no other staff members in this section of the building, and visiting hours had ended at 9 p.m. The voice came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, elderly and strained, with an oddly formal cadence that reminded Barbara of the way people spoke in old movies. Edgar, I've come for you, just like I promised. Barbara felt her heart rate increase as she tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Cedar Ridge Community Hospital was an old building, and sound could travel in unexpected ways through the aging ductwork and between floors. Perhaps she was hearing a conversation from another part of the hospital, distorted by the building's acoustics. But as she moved toward the source of the sound, Barbara realized the voice was coming from the direction of the emergency stairwell at the end of the quiet wing. The stairwell doors were locked after 10 p.m. for security reasons, accessible only with a key card that was carefully monitored and logged. Edgar, don't make me wait any longer. You know why I'm here. The words made Barbara's blood freeze. She thought of Edgar's earlier agitation, his warnings about someone named Martha coming for him. But that was impossible. The stairwell was locked, the building was secure, and there was no way an unauthorized person could have gained access to this wing without triggering multiple security protocols. Barbara approached the stairwell door and found it slightly ajar, which shouldn't have been possible. The magnetic lock required a key card to open, and the door was designed to close automatically for security reasons. She peered through the opening but saw only darkness beyond, lit by the dim red glow of the emergency lighting system. "Hello," Barbara called hesitantly into the stairwell. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. This is a restricted area." The response came immediately, and it was directly behind her. "Thank you for taking care of him, dear." Barbara spun around to find an elderly woman standing in the hallway, perhaps 20 feet away. She was tiny, probably not even 5 feet tall, with white hair hanging loose around her shoulders and wearing what appeared to be a hospital gown from a much earlier era. The fabric looked yellowed with age, and the style was distinctly different from the modern gowns used by Cedar Ridge Community Hospital. But there was something profoundly wrong with the woman's appearance. Her skin had a grayish pallor that reminded Barbara of the terminal patients in their final hours, and her eyes reflected the dim hallway lighting in a way that human eyes shouldn't. Most disturbing of all, she cast no shadow on the polished linoleum floor, despite the overhead lighting that should have created a clear silhouette. "Ma'am, how did you get up here?" Barbara asked, her nursing training overriding her growing sense of unease. "Are you a patient? Let me help you back to your room." The woman tilted her head, studying Barbara with those strange, reflective eyes. "I'm here for Edgar. We have unfinished business, he and I." "I'm sorry, but visiting hours ended at 9 p.m., Barbara said firmly, though her voice was beginning to shake. "You'll need to come back tomorrow. I can have security escort you to the lobby." But as Barbara reached for the call button on her belt radio, the woman moved. She didn't walk or run, she simply appeared closer, now only 10 feet away, as if the space between them had contracted without her actually moving through it. The temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably, and Barbara could see her breath beginning to mist in the suddenly frigid air. "Edgar has been running from me for 57 years, the woman said, her voice carrying an odd echo that seemed to reverberate from the walls themselves. "He won't run anymore." Barbara's finger found the panic button on her radio, but before she could press it, she heard Edgar Thorne screaming. The sound came from room 314, a raw, terrified shriek that cut through the hospital's nighttime quiet like a blade. Barbara ran toward the room, her training overwhelming her fear. She burst through the door to find Edgar sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with terror, staring at the window. "She's here," he gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "She's here, just like she said." Barbara looked toward the window, but saw only the reflection of the room's dim lighting against the dark glass. They were on the third floor. There was no way anyone could be at the window from the outside. But as she looked more closely, she noticed that ice was beginning to form on the inside of the glass, creating intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Mr. Thorne, you're safe," Barbara said, moving to his bedside while glancing back toward the doorway. The elderly woman in the hospital gown was nowhere to be seen. "You had a nightmare. There's no one at the window." But Edgar grabbed her wrist with surprising strength for an elderly man recovering from a heart episode. "You don't understand," he whispered urgently. "Martha died in 1939. I was there when they buried her. She's been dead for 57 years. The room suddenly felt much colder, and Barbara noticed her breath was now clearly visible in small puffs of vapor. The heart monitor attached to Edgar began beeping rapidly as his pulse soared, and the digital readout showed his blood pressure climbing to dangerous levels. "Mr. Thorne, I need you to try to stay calm," Barbara said, though she could hear the shakiness in her own voice. "I'm going to call Dr. Martinez and see if we can give you something to help you relax." She reached for the call button beside Edgar's bed, but the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the room in an eerie red glow that made everything look like a scene from a horror movie. Through the doorway, Barbara could see that the power outage extended to the entire quiet wing, though the main part of the hospital still appeared to have electricity. "Edgar," came the voice from the hallway, closer now, and carrying that same impossible echo. "I've waited so long, Edgar. Don't make me wait any longer." Edgar's grip on Barbara's wrist tightened until she worried he might cut off her circulation. "Don't let her take me," he pleaded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Please, I know what I did was wrong, but it was so long ago. I was just a boy." Before Barbara could ask what he meant, the temperature in the room plummeted further. Ice began forming on the inside of the window more rapidly, creating elaborate patterns that seemed to move and shift in the emergency lighting. The heart monitor attached to Edgar began beeping so rapidly that the individual sounds blended into a continuous alarm. "I need to get you out of here," Barbara said, beginning to disconnect Edgar from the monitors. Whatever was happening, whether it was a gas leak causing hallucinations or some kind of electrical malfunction affecting the environmental controls, her priority was patient safety. But as she helped Edgar to his feet, the woman appeared in the doorway. Up close in the red emergency lighting, Barbara could see details that made her stomach churn. The woman's hospital gown was not just yellowed with age, but stained with what looked like dried blood around the collar and sleeves. Her feet were bare and dirty, as if she'd been walking through soil for decades. Most disturbing of all, her skin had the waxy, translucent quality of someone who had been dead for a very long time, and Barbara could see dark veins beneath the surface like a roadmap of decay. "Hello, Edgar," Martha said, her voice carrying that same impossible echo. "Did you think you could hide from me forever?" Edgar collapsed back onto the bed, his heart monitor now screaming with alarms that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. "Martha, please," he sobbed. "I was 17. I didn't mean for it to happen. You pushed me down those stairs, Edgar. You left me to die alone in that basement while you ran away and started a new life." Barbara found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Martha turned those reflective eyes toward her, and Barbara felt as if she was looking into two deep wells filled with dark water that had been stagnant for decades. "Oh, it's very real, dear. Edgar has been carrying his secret for 57 years, and secrets have a way of calling us back." The room began to shake, as if the hospital was experiencing an earthquake. Picture frames fell from the walls, and the heart monitor toppled over, its alarms finally falling silent. Through the shaking, Barbara heard something that chilled her to the bone, the sound of dozens of footsteps in the hallway outside, all moving toward room 314 with the same shuffling rhythm she had heard earlier. "Who else is out there?" Barbara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Everyone Edgar hurt," Martha said simply. "Everyone who died because of his choices. We've all been waiting." Barbara looked toward the doorway and saw shadows moving in the hallway, dozens of figures in various states of decay and despair. Some wore clothing from decades past, others hospital gowns like Martha's. All of them had the same waxy, translucent skin and those terrible reflective eyes that seemed to glow with their own cold light. "This is impossible," Barbara whispered, though her voice carried less conviction than she would have liked. "Is it?" Martha asked. "Edgar, tell the nice nurse what you did after you killed me." Edgar was hyperventilating now, his elderly heart struggling with the stress of the supernatural confrontation. I became a doctor," he gasped. I thought if I saved lives, it would make up for what I did. But it didn't, did it?" Martha's voice was getting louder, more distorted, as if it was coming from multiple sources at once. "Because you kept making the same choices, kept hurting people when it was convenient for you. Barbara listened in growing horror as Edgar began to confess to a lifetime of crimes hidden behind his respectable facade as a small-town doctor. He'd been a medical student in 1939 when he killed Martha Henley, a young nurse who had discovered his theft of morphine from the hospital pharmacy. But Martha's death had been only the beginning of a pattern that would continue for 6 decades. Throughout his medical career, Edgar had prioritized his own interests over patient welfare whenever the two came into conflict. Experimental treatments conducted without proper consent, medications withheld from patients who couldn't pay, cases where he'd known about dangerous conditions in the hospital but remained silent to protect his position. Mrs. Henderson died because you knew the anesthesia equipment was faulty but didn't want to delay your vacation, Martha said. Little Billy Ross died because you prescribed the wrong medication and were too proud to admit your mistake. With each name Martha spoke, another shadow stepped forward from the hallway. Barbara saw a middle-aged woman in a floral dress from the 1960s, a young boy wearing clothes that looked decades out of date, an elderly man in work overalls. All of them staring at Edgar with those same impossible eyes that reflected light like mirrors. How many? Barbara asked, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Edgar or to Martha. 43, Martha replied. 43 people who died because Edgar Thorne valued his reputation more than human life. The shaking intensified, and Barbara realized with growing panic that she needed to get out of the room. Whatever was happening here, whatever Edgar had done, she didn't want to be caught in the middle of what appeared to be some kind of supernatural reckoning. She moved toward the doorway, but the shadows blocked her path. Up close, she could see the individual faces of Edgar's victims, each one bearing the marks of their particular tragedy. Some showed signs of surgical complications, others the effects of medication errors or delayed treatment. All of them radiated a cold that seemed to seep into Barbara's bones. "Let her go," Edgar said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all night. "She had nothing to do with this. She's a good nurse. She helps people." Martha considered this, her head tilting at an unnatural angle that suggested her neck had been broken long ago. "Yes," she said finally. "She does help people. She's nothing like you, Edgar." The shadows parted, creating a narrow path toward the hallway. Barbara hesitated, looking back at Edgar. Despite everything she'd just learned about him, her nursing instincts rebelled against abandoning a patient, even one who had committed such terrible crimes. "Go," Edgar whispered. "This has to end." "I've been running for too long." Barbara nodded and walked quickly toward the doorway, trying not to look at the decaying figures that lined her path. As she reached the hallway, she heard Martha speak one final time. "It's time to come home, Edgar." The scream that followed would haunt Barbara's dreams for the rest of her life. It was a sound of pure terror and anguish, the cry of a man finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of hidden evil. The sound echoed through the quiet wing for what seemed like hours, though it probably lasted only seconds. Then silence. Barbara ran down the hallway toward the security camera at the entrance to the quiet wing, hoping that whatever was recorded might somehow make sense of what had just happened. Behind her, the lights flickered back on, and the terrible cold began to dissipate. The hospital's normal sounds returned, the hum of ventilation, the distant beeping of monitors, the soft footsteps of staff members going about their duties. When she reached the main part of the hospital, she found Linda Morrison dealing with what appeared to be a power surge that had affected several sections of the building's electrical systems. "Barbara," Linda called. "Thank goodness. Did you feel that earthquake? And the power's been going crazy for the last 10 minutes. "We need to call security," Barbara said, her voice shaking. "And Dr. Martinez. Something's happened to Mr. Thorne." They returned to room 314 together, Linda carrying a flashlight and a radio to call for backup. The room was empty. Edgar Thorne was gone, along with all traces that he'd ever been there. The bed was made with military precision, the monitors were neatly arranged and functioning normally, and there was no sign of the chaos Barbara had witnessed. Even Edgar's chart had vanished from the nurse's station, leaving no record of his admission or treatment. "Are you sure you had a patient in here tonight?" Linda asked, checking the room number against her assignment sheet. "I don't show anyone assigned to 314. Barbara stared at the empty room, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "He was here," she insisted. "Edgar Thorne, 81 years old, admitted with chest pains. But when they checked the computer system, There was no record of Edgar Thorne ever being admitted to Cedar Ridge Community Hospital. No admission paperwork, no insurance information, no emergency contact forms. It was as if he'd never existed. The security footage from the camera at the entrance to the quiet wing showed Barbara entering and leaving the wing several times throughout the night, but never showed anyone else. No elderly man being admitted, no mysterious woman in a hospital gown, no shadows moving through the hallways. According to the official record, Barbara had spent her shift caring for patients who weren't there. Dr. Martinez arrived within an hour, and after listening to Barbara's story and conducting a brief examination, he ordered a complete psychiatric evaluation. The hospital administration was more concerned with liability issues, worried that Barbara might be having some kind of breakdown that could affect patient care and potentially expose the hospital to lawsuits. Stress-induced hallucinations was the official diagnosis, brought on by years of working night shifts and recent family pressures. Barbara knew about the family pressures. Her daughter Sarah had been struggling with addiction for the past 2 years, and the emotional toll had been enormous. The financial strain of trying to get Sarah into treatment programs, combined with the stress of watching her only child destroy her life with drugs, had pushed Barbara to her breaking point. It would be easy to accept the medical explanation, to believe that her mind had simply cracked under the strain and created an elaborate fantasy to cope with her stress. But 3 days later, Barbara was cleaning out her locker when she found Edgar Thorne's chart. It was tucked behind her personal belongings, written in her own handwriting, documenting every vital sign check, every medication administered, every note about his condition throughout the night of March 23rd. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as if it had aged decades overnight, and the ink had faded to a brownish color that reminded Barbara of dried blood. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that wasn't hers, someone had written, "Thank you for your kindness." E.T. Barbara never returned to Cedar Ridge Community Hospital. She moved to Salt Lake City, took a day shift position at a larger hospital, and tried to convince herself that what happened that night was nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination brought on by years of difficult working conditions and personal trauma. But she kept Edgar's chart, and she began to research the history of Cedar Ridge and its medical facilities. What she found changed everything. Edgar Thorne had been a real person, a doctor who had practiced medicine in various small towns throughout Utah, Nevada, and Colorado from 1955 to 1995. Newspaper archives contain multiple stories about medical malpractice lawsuits, suspicious patient deaths, and a doctor who always seemed to move on to a new hospital just before investigations could catch up with him. More disturbing were the records of disappearances that followed Edgar's career like a shadow. In every town where he had worked, young nurses had vanished without explanation. Women who had worked night shifts, who had been known for their dedication and willingness to question unsafe practices. Women who had simply disappeared, leaving behind family and friends who never learned what happened to them. Barbara found newspaper clippings about Martha Henley, a 21-year-old nurse who had vanished from Cedar Ridge in 1939. According to the reports, Martha had been scheduled to work a night shift at the medical clinic, but never arrived. Her family had reported her missing, but the investigation was brief and inconclusive. The prevailing theory was that she had left town to take a job elsewhere, though no one could explain why she would leave without telling anyone or taking her belongings. The final piece of evidence was Edgar's obituary from the Cedar Ridge Herald, dated March 24, 1996, the day after Barbara's encounter with him in the hospital. The obituary was brief, mentioning only that Dr. Edgar Thorne had been found dead in his home of an apparent heart attack. There was no mention of him being admitted to the hospital the night before. According to the medical examiner's report, which Barbara obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, Edgar's body had been discovered by a neighbor who had become concerned when he didn't pick up his morning newspaper. The estimated time of death was approximately 2:30 a.m. on March 24th, exactly when Barbara had witnessed his final encounter with Martha and her assembled victims. 28 years later, in 2024, Barbara Wright was dying of cancer in a hospice facility outside Salt Lake City. Her daughter Sarah, now clean and sober for 15 years and working as a substance abuse counselor, was going through her mother's belongings when she found a yellowed folder marked 1996, the night I saw the truth. Inside was Edgar Thorne's chart, along with dozens of newspaper clippings, medical records, and police reports that Barbara had collected over the years. The evidence painted a picture of a serial killer who had used his position as a doctor to prey on vulnerable patients and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose his crimes. Sarah brought the folder to her mother's bedside. Barbara was heavily sedated for pain management, drifting in and out of consciousness, but her eyes focused when she saw the yellowed chart. "It really happened, didn't it?" Sarah asked quietly. Barbara nodded weakly. "Some secrets," she whispered, "are too heavy to carry alone. And some people deserve to be remembered. Both the good they did and the harm they caused." She died 3 days later, still clutching Edgar Thorne's chart. The hospice staff found it strange that a woman known for her practical, no-nonsense approach to nursing would hold on to what appeared to be an elaborate fantasy for nearly 3 decades. But when they tried to remove the chart from Barbara's hands after she passed, they found it had crumbled to dust, leaving only the faint smell of old paper and something else they couldn't quite identify. Something that reminded them of flowers left too long on a grave. And underneath that, barely perceptible, the smell of hospital disinfectant from an era long past. The investigation that began with Barbara's research eventually led to the discovery of Edgar Thorne's victims in abandoned mine shafts in remote locations throughout the Mountain West. 43 bodies were recovered, spanning 6 decades of hidden murders. The case became one of the largest medical serial killer investigations in American history. But perhaps the most important outcome was the establishment of the Martha Henley Foundation, created by Sarah Wright using the insurance money from her mother's death. The foundation works to investigate suspicious deaths in medical facilities and advocates for stronger oversight of healthcare professionals. The foundation's first major case involved the demolition of the old Cedar Ridge Community Hospital in 2018. Construction workers reported strange occurrences during the teardown: tools that moved on their own, voices heard in empty rooms, and the discovery of dozens of old patient charts hidden in the walls of what used to be the quiet wing. The charts documented patients who had never officially existed, treatments that had never been recorded, and deaths that had never been investigated. At the bottom of each chart, in the same faded brown ink that Barbara had found on Edgar Thorne's paperwork, someone had written, "The truth will find its way." The night shift continues at the new Cedar Ridge Medical Center, staffed by young nurses who know nothing about the old hospital's history. But sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, they report unusual occurrences. Elderly patients who speak of visitors who couldn't possibly be there, monitors that show impossible readings, and occasionally the faint sound of footsteps in empty hallways, as if someone is still making rounds, still checking on patients who have been waiting far too long for someone to hear their stories. The truth, as Barbara Wright learned on that cold March night in 1996, has a way of preserving itself. And sometimes when the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin in the quiet hours before dawn, justice finds its way to those who have waited decades for their stories to be told. This incredible true story of Barbara Wright and the night that changed everything reminds us that some mysteries run deeper than we can imagine, and that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. The courage of one nurse on a quiet night shift in 1996 ultimately led to the exposure of one of the most horrific medical conspiracies in American history. What happened in room 314 that March night in Cedar Ridge, Utah, defies easy explanation. But sometimes the most important truths are the ones that challenge everything we think we know about the world around us. If this story left you questioning what really happens in the quiet corners of our hospitals during the darkest hours of the night, you're not alone. The mysteries we explore on this channel prove that reality is often stranger and more terrifying than any fiction. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most puzzling disappearances and cold case that continue to baffle investigators. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures that victims like Martha Henley and the other nurses who disappeared are never forgotten. Leave a comment below and let us know, do you believe Barbara Wright really encountered something supernatural that night? Or do you think there's a logical explanation for what happened in room 314? Have you ever experienced anything unexplained during a night shift or late-night hospital visit? Share your thoughts and theories. Your insights often help us piece together the puzzles in these complex cases. And if you know of any similar cases or mysterious disappearances that you think we should investigate, please let us know in the comments section. Remember to like this video if you found Barbara's story as compelling as we did. These cases take months of research to bring to you, and your engagement helps us continue investigating the mysteries that matter most. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the most disturbing and unexplained cases we've ever covered. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the most ordinary night can become extraordinary in ways we never expect. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching for the truth, and never forget that every mystery has a story worth telling.